come from a long line of family military service, and before politics, before anybody had a political position on anything, most of the people I know that choose to go in the military in whatever component they choose are just patriots. They love their country. They want to go defend their country. It really isn't about who's at the top of a political spectrum or what party they affiliate with. We sincerely want to go out and defend our country. I think that changed somewhere along the way. Somehow.
Yes, this is the Mark Haney Show, on a mission to ignite the entrepreneurial revolution right here in the hometown we love. And we do that by building the Backyard Advantage, the most connected community in the world for local entrepreneurs. It's based around this culture of love, helping one another. And it's really one entrepreneur at a time, one conversation at a time. And that conversation, we like it to start with, what are you working on? How can I help? That's the way we show a little love to one another. Just try to help everybody. Give first philosophy, pay it forward mentality. So today on the show, we're going to be talking to a couple of people that are really doing something above and beyond from my perspective. We'll let them share their story. Ian Boeye, he's the Chief Operations Officer of the Special Operations Association of America, and he's brought along Jeremy Thompson. He is the Executive Director of SOAA. So welcome to the show, guys. And if I'm talking a little bit funny, I just got back from the dentist, okay? Just walked in the door, probably about the same time you guys got here. Novocaine and all that, as I got a temporary crown put in. I did not know I was going to get shot up with Novocaine, but I may slur a little bit during the conversation, so I'm not drunk yet. So anyway, welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Now, why don't we start off with you, Ian? Maybe just a little bit of your background and maybe a little bit of an overview of, you call it SOAA?
Yeah.
Of SOAA. Your background, what led you to SOAA?
Yeah. So I'm a local boy, born and raised in Newcastle, California. Lived and worked all over the world. Found SOAA after 5 years in the greater intelligence apparatus, and they've been instrumental in helping veterans get care and advocating for the veteran. And it really drew me to the brotherhood because I had come home injured, morally, psychologically, physically. And it was them that helped get me through the door of treatment and saved me and my family.
And now they helped you, and so now you've taken a role with the organization. It's a non-profit, from what I understand. Maybe size of the organization, that type of thing. Maybe just give us a little bit of a context. Jeremy, you want to give your background and maybe jump into some of these questions too? So we'll make it conversational. Sure. So you guys can interrupt each other and you can interrupt me. Okay, let's set the rules.
Sure. So I think right now the Special Operations veteran community represents somewhere between 60 and 70,000 personnel. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and they're all Special Operations components. And can I because a lot of our listeners are not military, and I'm not either, although I have some awareness. Special operations, that's the badasses, right? Those are like they're all, we appreciate everybody who protects and serves, but the special operations are sort of an elite level. Is that right? Yes, sir. So nobody gets into the special operations arena without heavy vetting and a pretty grueling psychological and physical challenging process. Each component has a selection process of its own. Whether you're going to be a Navy SEAL or a Green Beret or an enabler of some kind, it's an each your own community. You can't stay if you're not a self-starter. And, and you'll be rotated out very quickly if you're not fitting the bill.
It's a merit-based scenario.
Certainly, people of above average intelligence and physical capability.
Wow. Okay, so. Didn't mean to interrupt you. I gave ourselves all license to interrupt, so I'll do a little interrupting too. So go ahead, maybe share a little bit more.
No, that's fine. So several of us had been involved in different advocacy arenas in and around the D.C. area on behalf of veterans across the spectrum. But what we realized somewhere along the way is that the special operations community wasn't specifically being advocated for at a level that we thought was appropriate or sufficient. So a couple of us got together, got our brains together, started strategizing how we could better
represent the special operations community on all levels, all service components. And we established a headquarters in D.C. With a couple of guys that we have that live in and around the area. And most of us had relationships through previous organizations with a certain congressman or senator's office, or maybe even the executive branch. So we're fighting to maintain that through rapport, respect, experience, and advocate for these men and women who wouldn't have a voice if somebody's not up there taking on that fight.
And when you're advocating, who are you advocating to? Is it the political establishment?
So the Special Operations Association of America originally was going to be a legislative advocacy organization. It turned into a multi-component organization after some hiccups in structure and decision making. Everybody's familiar with what happened in Afghanistan with the evacuations and special operations veterans who weren't currently in uniform jumping through hoops to get in there and help where they could.
Are you talking about like in Afghanistan, the last few days that we were there where we sort of shot our way out of there?
That's
and
right.
There was a local girl from my high school that ended up getting killed in that last firefight too, from what I understand. So, that was an embarrassment, if to say the least. So, so the special operations people were a part of that.
Yes. So the Special Operations Association of America sent several to help with the evacuations and establishing refugee statuses around the globe. Really, we used different methods, assets, and components to get people off of the Kabul airfield into some level of safety to where they could be vetted later to go anywhere other than Afghanistan.
Okay, so I'm going to dive a little bit deeper onto this so that just make it more clear for me and our audience. So you started off as an advocacy group, which you were advocating for policy that would be good for special operations people. And I want to dive a little bit. Are you still doing that, by the
Absolutely.
way? Okay, you're still doing that. But then you brought up something that sounds a whole heck of a lot different than being a lobbyist or advocacy type work. You went to Kabul while we were trying to get out of there alive, and help protect people with you were armed and dangerous.
We like to say that we're America first, and we want to keep Americans safe. So if that means putting ourselves at risk with our experience, our background, and applications of thought, we try to be unconventional in the way that we.
So you assembled special operations personnel, went into a hostile environment, and helped bring people to safety.
That's correct.
Wow. Okay, that sounds like two really different kinds of work. One is very, I don't know, I will almost think of it as like a sales job, if you will, but you're basically talking about laws, and it's very, let's call it white collar, for lack of a better term. And the other one is the badass guys going in and taking, helping out where nobody wants to be.
We want to make sure that this community is staffed, equipped, and trained to be the best on the planet.
Okay, so you went in there with your personnel, or who did you assemble to go in there and provide this work?
It was a strategic line of thought or line of effort at the top of the organization. The CEO and founder, Daniel Elkins, has a very broad network throughout the special operations community. His network extends throughout the D.C. area, and we were able to jump through enough hoops and components to get this thing funded in almost a 24 to 72 hour time frame to put enough people over there to make a little bit of a difference.
And I know you do much. I'm diving into this because I just want to make sure it's really interesting to me. But I want to go into the entirety of the organization as well. But
sure.
So at that time, we made the decision to get out, and we're getting out fast, and we're leaving our weapons, our tanks, we're leaving everything behind. And as I remember hearing the story, we're kind of like at an airport, and we're just trying to like get people on planes and things like that. And so as that's happening over a couple of day period, you're in negotiations with somebody at the Pentagon? How does that
we
work?
work mostly with the State Department, just to make sure that we don't over-exercise our authority.
Okay, so the State Department is so who do you deal with at the State Department?
We've dealt with the senior officials at the very
wow.
top. Yes.
Okay, and then is there a contract that goes into hiring this private organization, this nonprofit private organization?
It was just an ask in this regard. I mean, they asked if we could assist, and we put some thoughts together and said yes, we can assist. We have people that have the skill set, the background, and the willingness and the availabilily to go see if we can get Americans to safety.
Wow! So
that was the premise.
Okay,
of the
so
whole.
you flew into the airport, or was it helicoptered in? How did everybody go in?
Mostly by civilian travel. We're considered, I guess, what you would call a non-government organization through 501c19 military nonprofit. So
so you fly in, and then how did you get out? Through the same
methods.
Okay,
yes.
So you didn't stay up until the very end, like the last flight out. Your guys didn't.
No, well, so there was different guys that went in different capacities around the region to set up different receiving locations to get. If you're going to push people out, you have to have places for them to go. And they were being pushed out by the hundreds and thousands over about a 14-day period. So,
And did you take out just special operations people, or did you take out like whoever was over there?
No, anybody that could be vetted through the State Department as having a blue passport. For
like people from our embassy. Do we have an embassy over there?
That was yes.
Okay.
Yes, but not just that. It was people that had American citizenship or something along those lines that the State Department would validate and say they can or they can't come onto the airfield and be evacuated.
Okay. So how did, that mission, was it successful?
I think it was hugely successful, and that morphed our organization into some form of credibility with decision makers throughout DC, I think, and allowed us to move into Israel 3 days before the ground war started in Gaza. There were Americans throughout Israel. They were a little bit anxious about what could or couldn't happen.
Before the more recent attacks, well, I guess it was October. I guess it was like a year ago. Huh?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah.
The October attacks by Hamas generated, what's happening now between Israel and Gaza.
And you went in there prior to the first attack, or
yes,
you went in
that's
there?
Correct.
You had intelligence that was coming.
I think we all knew something was coming.
Okay, gotcha. So you guys went in there prior, and then so your people were there. Was it October 6th? Was that the date? I'm trying to get the dates right. October 6th.
Yes,
were you guys there on October 6th when?
Directly after. So that was a surprise attack. So nobody really knew that was coming. But our response was a result of those actions.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Wow.
So that pillar of our Special Operations Association that has, we've rescued over 5,000 Americans and their allies from then to now, including if you want to talk about some of the more recent.
Around the world, yeah. Because of our broad network, we were able to reach out and see who we have operating in a certain area, or maybe even living in a certain area that has a special operations background that is an affiliate of our organization. They may be a former Ranger or a Navy SEAL or a Green Beret or any of those service components. And the network is large enough to where I got a phone call not too long ago about a family that had been shot at in Ecuador. And instead of getting on a plane and flying to Ecuador to see if we can help this family get evacuated, we make phone calls, generate our network, and see if we can get them out quicker than the State Department could. So we're affecting things in hours in some cases where it may take days or weeks.
Interesting. What sounds like that's just an example. You said 5,000. Are there? Can you give more examples that are like that? Is there 5,000? These are all people that are in harm's way or potentially going to be in harm's way. Yeah, so you're going
potentially
in there.
could be and want to be evacuated. Don't want to be in a situation that could unfold in a bad direction.
Okay. Okay, so that's one of the pillars of the organization is this these rescue operations. Is that a fair statement? What do you guys call it?
We do not want to be looked at as a rescue organization.
Okay, forgive me.
This was certainly something.
My vocabulary in this realm is less strong than it probably ought to be.
No, that's fine. This was good-hearted men and women that have a background with the experience and the knowledge to go into these places and be effective. And
they're armed. They've got everything they need to attack. Or
we're equipped. We're equipped to protect ourselves or whoever it is that we may be evacuating. And that comes in so many different frames and angles.
Okay. But is some of this stuff confidential? I assume some of it.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah. Okay.
We try to keep it between the lines and not get too deep in conversation on methods and tactics, but just the willingness of people to go do things like that, I think, is pretty special.
How do you recruit for the organization?
So through our website, SOAA.org. If you're a former special operations community operator or enabler, then we want to hear from you. We want you to email us and become a member of the organization and see what we can do to grow it, make it better.
Wow. Okay, so that's pillar. Okay, the first pillar is the advocacy. I take it.
Legislative advocacy is how we started.
Legislative advocacy, and then are there other things you've done? Other, I guess, divisions of the organization.
Politics and policy are becoming a stronger component of what we do right now.
Okay.
Establishing those relationships I talked about earlier, those that we've become either personal or professional friends with that are in decision-making positions. And we're trying to utilize the organization and the experience of the people in the organization to affect good policy. And the policy that we talk about the most is patriotic, pro-American policy, getting back to the roots of our country and what founded it and what made it so great in the first place. And try to get rid of, I think, what the current War Department is calling debris.
Yeah.
We don't need debris. If we're gonna be the greatest nation on earth, we've got to get rid of that.
Yeah. Agreed. So, Ian, I think you know this. My son was in Afghanistan. He was wounded in 2012, medevaced out and so on, multiple surgeries. And so now we've got this organization called Allegiant Vets where we help people as they're getting out of the military. I think we're the largest in the country in terms of, it's called Allegiant Vets, and we help the last 3 to 6 to 9 months of their commitment to the military. They go through a sort of a transitionary process with us. And one of the things that I see with our community is the gratitude for the fact that they're not alone, right? So these communities are so strong in, I guess, helping you, get off on the right foot as you're getting out of the military. As my son got out of the military, and as a lot of service members get out of the military, they go back to their hometown, potentially, go back to Newcastle maybe. My son came back here to, we lived in Loomis at the time. And I do think that at some point he felt alone. And so it's been pretty therapeutic for him to build out this organization. And I've seen what it's done for others. But it sounds, Ian, like your situation was more dire in a way from an emotional standpoint. You had done some things and you had came back broken in many ways. Maybe share with that story, and then you mentioned at the beginning that this organization was a part of your journey back.
Yeah, so I've been rubbing shoulders with SOAA since the Afghan exit in other parts of the world. And so when I came home, I had a torn rotator cuff, torn ACLs, 5 herniations. I had AFib, really bad, anxiety, headaches, couldn't leave my house. And it was through some of the local functional medicine physicians that started to listen to me and my story and, get my hormones checked, got me stem cells. I went through hallucinogen-assisted therapy here locally with a guy out of the med school.
Is that ketamine type stuff? Yeah.
And that was scary. I mean, it was someone telling you you're going to eat a hallucinogen and you can't go to the grocery store. It took a lot of support from people who've been through it, who have been there, and it gave me my life back.
And you have some ketamine, and it puts you in a state where you want to open up and, I guess, face some of the things you went through. Is that how that? Is that like is there kind of a therapy associated with it besides just taking the hallucinogenics?
Yeah. So the hallucinogen creates sort of a plasticity, like a moldability of your brain, so to speak, and then you're processing that in a way that it's allowing the ruminating thoughts, the anxiety, those things to dissipate. Because just talking about it doesn't work. And so, I mean, we've lost 6,000 veterans a year for the last 22 consecutive years to suicide.
Yeah, there used to be a number, maybe it still exists, 23 per day. Is that number still?
22 a day.
22 a day.
Campaign.
Okay.
Yeah, and the risk for special operations is, up to 3 times that. And so it's very important for our community to be able to find curative medicine that's going to make an impact on these numbers and save not just these soldiers that have put it all on the line, but their families. And do these, like what your son's doing, I think is so admirable. We look forward to working with him and helping transition our special operations guys into our program, and giving them their lives back.
What can you tell? So you said you described some of your injuries. What can you tell us about what you went through in getting the physical injuries, and maybe what you I don't know what you can share about what you went through that gave you, let's call it some of the other things that are more on the emotional side?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's not a lot that I speak about in terms of the specifics, but something I learned was that humans are capable of extreme evil as well as extreme good. And you have a dissonance of, what keeps you alive overseas doesn't do well at Walmart.
Yeah.
And so, there's a transition that I think is, underappreciated.
I remember my son got shot. I think it was like it was June 6th or 7th, and he went through a few surgeries. And I think it was probably, I don't know, a couple weeks later, he was down in San Diego at Balboa Medical Center, and he ends up getting out of the hospital and going. He stayed in a hotel for, I don't know, a month or so until they found him housing. And he was with the Wounded Warrior Project, or Wounded Warrior Battalion there. He's a Marine. And I remember we went out to lunch, and it might have been like a mall. You mentioned Walmart. We went to a mall, and we were sitting in this outdoor patio having lunch. And I mean, I could tell, he had been home for a couple weeks at least. And he was still head on a swivel in a big way, where he probably still is today, but he's more subtle about it. But yeah, it was affecting him to be in a crowd of, let's say, a big patio with a couple hundred people on it. There was kind of an outdoor patio.
Yeah.
I could tell it was straining on him.
Oh yeah, I'm sure it's still there to some extent.
I used to describe it as coming home a little bit contaminated. You don't want to contaminate your family with your thoughts or your the things you're trying to process or decompress. And but sensory overload is a thing, and if you've never experienced it, you wouldn't know what I'm talking about. But walking into a Walmart or a Target or any kind of store with lights and a lot of people talking, the echoes can almost make you nauseous. You have to walk outside and separate that for a little bit until you can reach some level of decompression. It takes some people weeks, it takes some people years, depending on what their previous exposures to trauma may have been or how they process it. Not everybody has to be medicated. Not everybody goes through therapy, but I can tell you when I came home, I lived on a 50-acre farm in South Central Tennessee, and I stayed specifically on that farm and wouldn't even check the mail at the end of the driveway because I didn't want somebody to drive by, see me, and try to engage me in a conversation about what I had just gone through.
Wow. How long did that last for?
For me, in hindsight, my family may tell you longer, but I felt like I was getting back to some sense of normal after about 3 to 6 months.
And how long have you been out?
I did 22 years. I got out in July of 2022. But that deployment was early on in the Afghan war with the Special Forces A-Team, and that was from 02 to 03. I ended up on a team that utilized horses to navigate the mountainous terrain in north central Afghanistan for unconventional warfare operations.
So it makes me think of what we see in the movies, and I'm trying to think of that Mark Wahlberg movie. How realistic are some of these movies?
All movies have an element of Hollywood associated with them, but we all watch these movies and we critique them, and our wives hate watching them with us because we're talking through them and telling them what's real and what's not real through the whole thing. But
I would like to watch it with you guys.
Yeah,
I love watching that stuff. Not that I have a chance to watch movies with my son, but
But generally speaking, I think we can be somewhat appreciative that the story's being told and that it's being shown to the public in some kind of way that keeps it entertaining. But certainly there's a lot of risk in any combat environment, and guys and girls go out there and do some pretty amazing things on behalf of our national security, and we're super appreciative of it, and we want to continue that fight both in and outside of uniform.
Well, as long as we're talking about advocacy a little bit, we don't make this a political show, and it's just not. It's all about entrepreneurship and building businesses. In your organization, you built something really that's doing a lot of good. But I will, since you're in that realm at some level, I will ask you about that. Maybe your take on, you probably heard Pete Hegseth's recent presentation to all the generals and all the high command, and he's talking about a sort of a new way of viewing the Department of Defense. It's now the Department of War, which I think everybody knows, but also a cultural shift that he is putting forth. And it didn't sound like there's, he's not taking no for an answer. It's kind of like you're with me or you're out. And what's your take on that? Any takeaways?
So I come from a long line of family military service, okay. and before politics, before anybody had a political position on anything, most of the people I know that choose to go in the military in whatever component they choose are just patriots. They love their country. They want to go defend their country. It really isn't about who's at the top of a political spectrum or what party they affiliate with. We sincerely want to go out and defend our country. I think that changed somewhere along the way. Somehow or another, what is supposed to be an apolitical or a nonpartisan War Department became over politicized, where people at lower levels got to start thinking that they had authority to make decisions or resist the decisions of the people that they swore an oath to follow, as long as the orders were lawful, and it put us in a really bad spot for a number of years. And I think Pete Hegseth and the current administration are trying to get some level of accountability back on that. They're not going to get it all the way right, but it's something that's been lost on us for a while. And I didn't like it. I served 22 years under what I think was a deteriorated readiness.
So you had family members that are older than you, I take it. Like, was your dad or uncles or grandfathers?
My grandfather started as a combat medic in World War II.
Okay.
My other grandfather was in Korea and Vietnam multiple times.
And they were, at some level, they influenced you on understanding what they went through?
Yeah. Sure. Just general patriotism. If we're gonna, like, again, if we're gonna secure and defend the greatest nation on earth, we have to have people that love it enough to do that.
Mm-hmm. And we got softer over the last 40, 50 years. Is that a fair statement?
I think so.
And do you feel like this is sort of a pivot point for us?
So my grandfather told me that if you choose to make a career out of the United States Army and you get out in 20 or more years, you will not retire from the same army you joined. I didn't know what that meant.
He already knew it was changing.
Well, it changed for him, So politics and policy have changed since we existed as a nation. We're 236 years into this thing. So every 50 to 100 years, something changes drastically. But I think in my time, we got weaker and less ready based on the decisions that were made at the highest offices of our country. And I think we're in recovery to that. And I don't know how long it's going to take to recover, but I'm glad that there are men and women stepping up to make that recovery possible.
Well, it sounds like there's a new renewed interest in joining the military. So with Allegiant Vets, we have some awareness over the recruitment and what happens and how the difficulty in recruiting people to go in the Marine Corps or the Army or the Air Force. And it sounds like there's a turnaround happening in terms of people's interest in joining the new military, if you will, the Department of War, versus before there was maybe a little less enthusiasm around that over, in terms of quantity.
I think that's absolutely transparent. I don't think it matters who you talk to or what their thoughts on it are. We're having people beat the doors down to get in our military right now because they see definitive decisions being made to correct a broken ship, I guess, to rebuild the house a little bit. And they want to be part of rebuilding that on behalf of their country.
And what are we doing now from an advocacy standpoint? Maybe I'm jumping back to that. I dove hard into the maybe the more exciting stuff.
So again, we want to make sure that the men and women of the special operations community, they're the tip of the spear for all service components. They're often put forward behind the lines of battlefield operations weeks, sometimes months before the general public even knows it. So we want to make sure that decision makers have the ground truth based on experience and perspective, and that they're properly staffing, equipping, and training those forces. Everybody wants to be purposed, directed, and motivated. It doesn't really matter what you're involved with from a professional or personal perspective. You want those things. You want to be purposed and directed to do.
How do you... or what kinds of things are there some specifics on what you would advocate for to get them, let's say, equipped, like certain protective gear or weapons, or how do you, what do they want? What do these special operations people really want that they don't have?
Obviously, weaponry is revolving. The advanced technology is rapidly developing. You've got multiple DoD contractors throughout the spectrum that are constantly coming up with new ways to warfight. So we want to make sure that special operations troops are putting their hands on those things, exercising those things, and refining them to make them better. And they can't do that if they don't have the money to do that. Continued resolutions, as you know, we're in this fight right now of whether or not we're going to establish a budget or we're going to go forward funding our government under continued resolution. Continued resolution destroys readiness throughout the United States military. We need men and women who are going to go to Congress and do congressional things. We don't need activists. We need people who are going to go to Congress with a mission and a purpose to make sure that we're properly funded, not just the military, but the entire United States has to be funded appropriately. They passed a law in 1974, the Congressional Budget Act, and that's been somewhere around 50-something years ago that was passed, and that was to hold themselves accountable by law, that they would establish a budget for the President of the United States year after year without going into continued resolution. And they failed to do that 22 times over the last 50-something years.
Wow. So it's September 30th today that we're recording this. This might not come out for 10 days or something like that. So so we're on the eve of a potential government shutdown. That's because correct. We can't decide as legislators, we can't get enough compromise or agreement to move the ball. And it looks like both sides are kind of dug in. You're obviously very familiar with this. Any sense as to how a government shutdown might affect our readiness?
Absolutely. So every service component sends men and women to their training schools to get their MOS, their military occupational specialty, or their special identifiers. If they're at school right now, we go under a continued resolution, that budget gets significantly cut all the way to the point of recalling some of those troops, which prevents their front end training. It prevents their promotion eligibility, which stovepipes across the spectrum as to when you can get qualified in the field that you join the military in, and then at what year or what level you'll be able to compete for promotion along the way if you choose to make it a career.
And maybe I'm just going to kind of dive into some of the things that are interesting to me, and then at the end, I want to make sure you have a chance to, like, what did I not ask you that we can get this information out. But because of innovation, because of entrepreneurship, but innovators generally are changing the way wars are going to be fought. That's and right. Are being fought today. Maybe paint me a picture of how you see that changing over the next 5, 10, 15 years. You hear about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine with a lot of drones, right? So we imagine drones and autonomous vehicles and robotic type stuff happening and doing the fighting, so that we're less likely to have the frontline soldiers like what my son was in the infantry. Is how fast are we moving toward that in terms of putting less young men right in the middle of a firefight?
I think certainly AI is playing a heavy part in advanced weaponry and technology. Ian may be a better spokesperson for how AI integration is helping staff equip and train, and even the medical readiness of the force.
Yeah. So drone warfare is definitely an escalation, and not just the lethality. There's drones that can do facial recognition and loiter on a building waiting for somebody to come out. And swarm drones, and that creates a whole new psychological pressure on the warfighter that I think historically hasn't been there.
How many? I'm just going to ask some basic questions for our civilian audience here. How many drones are in a swarm?
It depends. I think. Do you know?
Is there like kind of it could be 100 drones or
Sure.
maybe more than that, and they all know how not to run into each other through. AI basically is empowering them to, basically it could attack a city, or it could attack, defend something potentially even too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and different, medical treatment. So, wound sets and wound patterns of drones is something that SOAA is looking into right now. Make sure.
Can you break that down for me? How would they would act as medical people?
Oh, sure. So like on A team in the Special Forces, they have 18 Deltas. They're SF medics that are part of these 12-man teams.
Okay.
And so, they're engaged in unconventional warfare, and that medic's job is to take care of that team and maybe the indigenous force that they're training.
And so the drone would bring out supplies, or what would he's not putting a tourniquet on somebody's leg.
No. So it's the type of wounds that drones inflict.
Oh, okay.
And so being able to understand what are the secondary and tertiary things that you need to think about when addressing that battlefield wound.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. How is that different than, let's say, getting hit with a machine gun or something?
Could be blast, shrapnel, concussive forces.
Okay.
So the secondary wounds are going to be different.
Okay, so they drop some kind of explosive device, and the shrapnel from the building it hits is going to injure somebody or wound somebody.
Sure, but more. I think it's more like a crowd like this, where some of these drones have like a waffle projectile, and it can address whether or not it's going to hit one of us or all of us. Okay. Depending on where it fires it from.
Okay, and then you said it can basically wait outside somebody's office or house and wait for them to come out, and then take them out when they recognize the face.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a new level of warfare.
And now you have there's another company we haven't brought up now, Ragnar, that is, you are actually involved in technology So you're sort of at the cutting edge of some of these innovations, if you will. Describe to me what Ragnar is, and then maybe some of the stuff that you're working on with Ragnar that might be in the realm of warfighting.
Sure. Good question. It's so for Special Operations Association, we rely on charitable donations. And so one of our initiatives was to create, not just a partnership for skill bridge and transition warfighters, but also to support the entrepreneurial special operations gentlemen and women. And it's for Ragnar. I mean, we opened up to create a profit engine where our entire ecosystem of companies, our profits go into SOAA to directly pay for curative medicine for these warfighters, as well as to support our other pillars.
Okay, let me make sure I understand this right. You provide technological help, support, and help build out companies. Is that right? And then as those companies succeed, the profits go into SOAA. Is okay. Is that right? Am I describing that correctly?
Absolutely correct. So we have now we have a dev shop. We've acquired one of the fastest growing AI companies in California. We're in acquisition for a defense AI company that was part of our initial missile defense creation, and they've been in tier 1 AI since day one. So they're rocket scientists.
So this is your dev shop has made these acquisitions.
Yeah.
Okay, so are you buying ideas and building them out like kind of like a venture studio, or is it? Do you guys have how do you get funded for that?
So we're after the human capital. It's the talent. It's finding executive teams that are on mission, that believe in what we're doing, and that was true of FYC and our other partners. They really got on board with us because they believe that they're keeping America safe in this partnership.
Wow. Okay, so I'm invested. I may have told you this. I don't know, or maybe Marcus did. I'm invested into something called the Veteran Fund, and I know that there's a few of these type of venture capital funds around the country, but this one is based in the Bay Area, and it's some former Marine type guys, but they're also, they built out a venture capital firm, and they're investing into some of this kind of technology. But us as limited partners, as investors, we expect a return on our investment, and not that we wouldn't be supportive of giving some of the upside to a SOAA type organization or to a nonprofit, but how do you provide the incentive structure for the very driven entrepreneur who may not want to give up all of his profits or her profits?
So this is a wall we're battling against constantly.
Okay.
And it's finding that alignment. So we've been able to do seller financing, or what we call the benevolent investor, who's come in and seed round some of our companies.
Okay.
And they're okay with our board's mandate that, we're giving X percentage back to SOAA, but then also making sure that the share price goes up and that our investors are paid.
Okay, so it ends up becoming a win-win-win. Everybody's incentivized.
You would think.
Yeah.
You would think. So we've talked to a lot of VCs, and that's always been the sticking point, because we've got, all this success and a great mission. It always gets us to the table. But then ultimately, they don't want to share.
Yeah. I wonder if there's something, but you're helping, if you've got the dev shop, you're adding a lot to, let's say somebody has an earlier idea and they need it built out. You're adding a lot so that's a win.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's, a lot of times if they don't have a dev shop or a venture studio or the right technology partner, the thing isn't going anywhere anyway. So you're basically a bridge that helps them to succeed more than just a philanthropic concept.
Yeah, and the people who invest in us, they get to take multiple shots on goal. It's, we've got, a captive audience here locally. We've partnered with Link2MD, which is a work comp company. We're building out their AI EMR and whole work comp system.
That's a corporation that's already well funded and up and going, and they're just paying you to do dev work for them?
We actually became partners on their cap table.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so a local developer, Alex Leone, was really visionary in coming up with a new approach to comp, which is an archaic medical system. Still print and mail, fax, has a lot of administrative complexity that doesn't need to be there. And that's somewhere AI can help. And so Alex believed in us and our mission, and we believed in the problem that he was solving. And so it was really a good marriage.
Well, I'm envisioning, let's use the venture fund, even though I'm not speaking for you guys at all, but they're kind of like the growth factory. They make these early stage investments. Sometimes they're the first check in, that type of thing, maybe after the friends and family round. And so they're seeing a lot of deal flow because these guys are involved in the startup community in a major way. So they see a lot of deal flow. They're also involved in the veteran community in a real way as well, which is something that got me interested into it. But we see so many startups that we can't say yes to very many, right? So we say no or not yet to most. And I would think to those, the ones where you're saying not yet, they would be a great introduction for somebody like you guys. And you can't say yes to that many of them either, I suppose. But still having those relationships where it's like, yeah, go see Ian and he can help get you back to us. And part of the new venture is we're giving some of it back to the, if it's a good enough idea, giving some back to SOAA seems like a reasonable idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's to pay for this curative approach to medicine. I mean, it's the access to stem cells, exosomes, peptides. These aren't covered by insurance. They're not part of the VA. And so, I mean, like for myself, I avoided 5 surgeries. Came off all the meds. It was...
and that sounds less like startup technology and more like, I don't want to say basic medical care, but stuff that you can kind of just get if you can pay for it, versus a new invention.
Yeah, and so we're tied into the Sierra Medical Partnership, which has been here for years, multi-specialty group. And then the Grid Training Center with Josh Pezel, who does the corrective exercise, did all my corrective exercise as I was being treated with stem cells and having soft tissue injuries healed that I was told were surgical.
Okay, so you're open to partnering with, I'll call that more of a Main Street type business. No offense to anybody, but something that's not typically venture backable, versus the drone capability, to the equipment that our warfighters need to use as they're fighting. It's a little bit apples and oranges. Would you agree? Am I seeing it from the same?
We're on both sides of the line. So within functional medicine, within corrective exercise, within allopathic medicine or what you would call traditional medicine, we're developing AI tools that the doctors are requesting. And so we have immediate adoption of what we create. And so we've had a lot of physician investors who have gotten different products off the ground for us. And then we've created stuff in SOAA to help us with, grant writing, government contracting, blog posting. We have a Ops Hub. And we're able to bring that to not just SOAA, but to the disabled veteran community, the nonprofit community. We do a lot with nonprofits.
Wow.
The companies we're acquired and acquiring have long histories. And so it sort of helps us in that why we appear to be a startup, we've brought in all this talent around a mission, and they're highly capable.
It's interesting because there's some complexities in the way you describe the set of, I guess, relationships that you're in the middle of. But the thing that I really am drawn to is this overall mission of what you're doing. You're helping keep us safer, and you're doing the right thing for our heroes, and which I think there's most of the population wants both of those things. So with that said, because we're running out of time, maybe what did I not ask you that would be like an important component of your message that we might try to get out today?
Yeah, so it's we're creating this profit engine to not just drive the treatment of veterans. I mean, when he talked about the other pillars that we have, supporting special operations guys to get into Congress, to be in elected positions, where they're the slowest to pull the trigger. And since the 1970s, there's just been a slow decline of the number of congressmen who've actually seen the horrors of war.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I want to drive home that point, or help you to drive home that point, that the people who have actually seen action, have actually pulled triggers, are the slowest to pull a trigger as a congressman or as a voter. We're the last ones to want to advocate for war.
Yeah, to send your sons and daughters to an unnecessary war. And
we would very much like to see the United States Congress and the executive branch get back to war declaration. If we must go to war, we should go to war with full intent to win it. There should be an established intent to enter a war. There should be an established intent to exit a war with a full win victory. And we really can't continue to send men and women into harm's way without at least honoring the processes of our founders and the way our country was supposed to be ran in the first place.
Yeah. So would you agree that in Afghanistan, the warfighters were handcuffed like crazy? They couldn't fully execute because there were too many rules and regulations stopping them from, one guy's an enemy right today, and tomorrow he's a friend, and it just depends on what hat he's wearing and who's looking over his shoulder. I remember talking to Marcus about that, and it's like, well, it's tough to know who's your friend and who's your enemy, and you're all in a city or a village.
It certainly sends a signal that the people making the decisions don't care as much as we do on the ground about winning and losing.
Yeah. Okay, so I sort of chime in when I want to give you guys the last mic drop. So anything else that you would like to make sure that our audience hears today?
I mean, from a legislative action standpoint, I mean, we've had 200 legislative meetings, a formal congressional testimony. We've got the JAX Act, which has identified female CST operators as special operators so that they can get the care that they need. The National Defense Authorization Act, which compels the Secretary of the Army to start testing hormones on special operators and start following that. And so we have a lot of great missions to support these fighters. And I think it's also, elevating and amplifying their voice within the halls and at the highest levels of our government. That's important.
I think it's quite possible that this podcast or this show may reach the men and women of the special operations community right here in the Sacramento area, and perhaps throughout the country at some point. And if there are issues out there that aren't being addressed at the congressional or executive branches, we need to know what they are so we can put it on the laps of the decision makers in Congress.
Interesting. Maybe I'll get Marcus to share this with I think he's got 20,000 people in his veteran community. So maybe get a few of his buddies to watch it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if there's investors interested in true impact investing, we're a great spot for that.
Okay, and I'll send this over to the guys over at the Veteran Fund.
Yeah,
and I mean, they're on my mailing list, but we'll make sure they get I'll send them a personal note.
And we're local. I mean, while we do a ton of work in DC, we've headquartered this entire operation out of Folsom. So we were building this, and that's where the talent is. Mm-hmm. And it's it's our backyard.
Yeah, for sure.
I was very inspired at your backyard event.
Thank you.
Supporting entrepreneurs here, but we see what you see, and that's this could be the next Silicon Valley, and so we're invested here.
I love it. Well, thank you guys for coming on the show. Thank you for what you do, and I'm sure you get thanks a lot, but America loves you guys. So just from an average Joe that's trying to build businesses, thank you for what you guys do.
Thank you for having us on the show.
Yeah,
we appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching today's show. My goal for every episode is that you find a takeaway, something tangible you can use in your business today. And if you have a comment about a favorite takeaway, feel free to put it in
in the box below. And if you have a topic that you'd like me to bring up on the show, don't forget to let me know. And also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to learn more about entrepreneurship. Because at Haney Biz, we are always by your side.